The fireworks had long since faded, their echoes swallowed by the night, leaving the streets eerily quiet. A soft snow blanketed the ground, untouched and pristine, reflecting the silvery glow of the streetlights. It was the first morning of the new year, a time for fresh starts and hopeful resolutions. But for one small town, it was the beginning of something they could never have imagined or escaped. It all started with a peculiar tradition. Every year at the stroke of midnight, the townspeople would gather in the square, ringing bells and shouting cheerfully to chase away the spirits of the past year. No one knew exactly when or why this custom began, but it was said to have been passed down for generations. Some thought it was just superstition. Others claimed it was a necessary ritual to keep the town safe. No one dared question it, until this year. Marcus Finch was not one for tradition. He had moved to town 6 months earlier, a skeptical city boy with no patience for quaint customs or rural folklore. He had watched the bell ringing and shouting from his apartment window the night before, shaking his head at the sheer absurdity of it. When his elderly neighbor, Mrs. Hensley, knocked on his door that afternoon, urging him to attend the evening's cleansing walk, he laughed it off. "Cleansing walk? Sounds like a bad yoga class," he joked, pouring himself another cup of coffee. Mrs. Hensley's face darkened, her eyes flickering with unease. "It's not a joke, Mr. Finch," she whispered. "If you don't walk, you might let them in." "Them?" he asked, smirking. "The Watchers," she said, her voice trembling. "They're always waiting for someone to forget." That night, as the town gathered for their walk, Marcus stayed home. He flipped through channels on his television, the sound of muffled bells and chanting drifting in through his window. By 11 o'clock, the streets had gone silent again, and he laughed to himself, thinking the whole thing was overblown. At midnight, the first sound came, a faint tapping, like fingernails against glass. He froze, setting his coffee cup down on the table. The sound was rhythmic, deliberate. It was coming from the window. "Probably just the wind," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. He pulled the curtains back and peered out into the darkness. Nothing. Just the pale outline of his backyard, the trees standing like frozen sentinels. He shook his head and walked away, convincing himself he was imagining things. But the tapping didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, echoing from every window in the house. He spun around, heart pounding. This wasn't the wind. Someone or something was outside. "All right, you got me," he called out nervously, hoping it was some elaborate prank. "Very funny." The response was immediate, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. "Come outside." The word sent a chill down his spine. He grabbed his phone, dialing Mrs. Hensley's number. It rang 3 times before her frail voice answered. "Mrs. Hensley, someone's outside my house," he stammered. "I think it's those kids from the square trying to scare me." The line went silent for a moment before she spoke. "You didn't walk, did you?"
"What?"
"You didn't join the cleansing walk." Her voice was sharp now, almost accusing. "No, but..." "Listen to me, Marcus. Do not open the door. Do not look outside, and whatever you do, do not acknowledge them." He opened his mouth to argue, but the line went dead. The whispering grew louder, now accompanied by a scraping sound, like claws dragging against the walls. He backed away, clutching the phone like a lifeline. The clock struck 12:15. The sound stopped. Marcus exhaled, relief washing over him like a wave. Maybe it really had been kids playing a prank. He laughed nervously, shaking his head at his own paranoia. He poured himself another cup of coffee and settled into his chair. Then came the footsteps. Soft at first, but deliberate, echoing through the hallway. He froze. He hadn't unlocked the door. No one could have gotten inside. "Hello?" he called out, his voice trembling. The lights flickered and the air grew icy. He could feel it now, a presence, heavy and oppressive, watching him. The footsteps drew closer, stopping just outside the living room. "Come outside," the voice whispered again, this time from right behind him. Marcus turned, but no one was there. The room was empty, save for the faint outline of handprints smudged against the foggy window. He bolted for the door, flinging it open and stumbling into the street. The town was eerily still, the snow untouched except for his own frantic footprints. And then he saw them. Figures stood in the distance, tall and shadowy, their faces obscured by darkness. They didn't move, didn't speak, but he could feel their gaze piercing through him. He backed away, heart racing, but the figures grew closer with every step he took, as if the space between them was collapsing. A voice echoed through the night, faint but unmistakable. "You let them in!" The next morning, the townspeople found Marcus's house empty. The snow outside was undisturbed, save for a single trail of footprints leading from his door to the forest. No one dared to follow them. They knew better.